Hi, this is Tom from MVP Chess. Welcome back to my series on Bobby Fischer seminal work, My 60 Memorable Games. In this video, we'll be analyzing game number 10 that Fischer played versus Unzicker in Zurich 1959. Before we get started, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. You can subscribe to my channel by clicking the subscribe button in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Thanks so much for your support. Really appreciate it. Okay. So we made it to the double digits. Fischer with the white pieces plays d4. No, of course he doesn't play d4. e4. Best by test. Come on, man. e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop e5, a6, bishop a4. Okay, we have another Spanish on the board. So as I mentioned in the last video, if you need a refresher on some basic Spanish opening theory, I would recommend you rewatch game number 6 versus Chacron, where I explained the opening moves in a little bit more detail. Knight f6, Fischer castles, bishop e7, rook e1. Okay, now there's a threat to the e5 pawn, so black must play b5. Bishop e3, d6. Okay, now black threatens to play knight a5, winning the Spanish bishop. Of course, we do not allow that. c3, giving the bishop a retreat square and also preparing d4. Castles, h3, preventing bishop g4. Knight a5. So Unzicker is opting for more of a classical Chigorin variation where he's chasing the bishop with the knight and looking to prepare c5. Bishop c2. Here we go. c5. Fischer counters with d4. So really normal development by both sides so far. Knight bd2. Fischer starts the classic Spanish queen's knight maneuver. This is heading to the king side and maybe towards the juicy f5 square. Bishop d7, knight f1, rook fe8, knight e3. Okay, so we're following the Chacron game very closely. Very closely indeed. g6 here by Unzicker. Okay, with the idea of artificially fianchettoing this bishop, taking a few tempi to do so. But it's nice that this g6 move controls this really key f5 square and also h5 to a lesser extent. So Fischer exchanges here and plays knight h2. This is the same maneuver that we saw in game 6 versus Chacron. Fischer's going to slam this knight on g4 and provoke his opponent into taking. Fischer will take back with the h-pawn and open up the h-file for a nice attack. Rook 88. Okay, let's watch this alignment. Okay, get the queen out of there. Don't mess around. Queen f3. Good move by Fischer. Bishop e6 and knight g4. So the first part of Fischer's opening plan is complete. Okay, with this series of knight maneuvers, Fischer has managed to open the h-file. And as we saw in the game versus Chacron, Fischer increased the pressure on the h-file by eventually playing g3, king g2, and then bringing a rook to the h-file. Chacron did a good job defending. Remember, he came up with a interesting knight maneuver to bring the knight all the way back to f8 to defend against the mate, but ended up losing that game due to a tactical oversight. But instead we have queen c6 here, g5, just like in the Chacron game. Fischer plays g5 to clamp down on these dark squares and is going to look to ideally maneuver the knight into g4 and really try to exploit these weak dark squares in black's position. Knight c4. Okay, just like Chacron did, Unzicker brings the knight from the edge of the board and tries to trade off this dangerous piece, but of course Fischer's not having it. We have an exchange here. And Unzicker opts to play pawn to f6 in this position, which Fischer criticizes. Okay, so rather than deal with the pressure on the h-file the way Chacron did, and as we talked about before, Chacron dealt with that by routing the knight back over to the king side as a key defender. Unzicker decides to defend a little bit more actively. Okay, this g5 pawn is really white's spearhead to this kingside attack. It's controlling a lot of the dark squares, and who knows, after g3, king g2, rook h1, h6 could support perhaps the doubling of rooks on the h file. So it's an important pawn. So Unzicker decides to play f6 to liquidate it. But of course, in chess, to get something, and what Unzicker got in this position was mitigating the potential pressure on the h file, you have to give something up. And what Unzicker gave up is slight weakening, well, not slight weakening, just a weakening of the 7th rank, and also of this e5 pawn. So let's look at how Fischer exploited that to great effect. Instructive move by Fischer here, pawn to a4. This is a great way versus Morphy's defense when black has played a6, b5, giving white a hook to pry open the a file with a4. This is a great way to activate this rook on a1. Because very often this bishop on c1 is doing just great. And this can save white a vital tempo for development and is much more flexible. Knight b6, so Fischer opens the a file. And now that the knight has retreated from its post on c4, then Fischer brings the bishop to e3. So, as Fischer states in the annotation, since both flanks are pretty fluid, okay, Fischer can look to play on the queen side, Fischer can look to play on the king side. The fact that Fischer has the two bishops is definitely a huge advantage for him. Also coupled with the fact that black's got some really weak pawns that Fischer can target with these bishops in his position, namely the ones that I've highlighted here. So Unzicker tries to contend the open a file. Of course, Fischer didn't take here. Okay, it's important to maintain the tension. He just simply played rook d1. Okay, now if Unzicker takes on a1, Fischer recaptures and gains the a file. If he doesn't take, well then Fischer just gained control over the open d file. So nice play, nice rook play by Fischer. Really instructive of how he looked to take control over the two open files in the position. Unzicker has to spend a tempo here, king h8, understandable. The other downside about playing f6 is it did critically weaken the a2 g8 diagonal, and Fischer does have this unopposed Spanish light squared bishop. So Unzicker spends a tempo to safeguard his king. We have b3 from Fischer, bishop g7. Looks like Unzicker's just trying to shore up some of the dark squares and put his bishop on a protected square. Queen h4, bishop f6, and now bishop g5. So Fischer, smartly in this position, exchanges off the dark squared bishops. Now you might be asking yourself, well, wait a minute, Tom. You just told me 5 minutes ago that the source of white's advantage in this position was that both flanks were fluid and that he had the bishop pair and can look to exploit those weaknesses with that material in bounds. Well, Fischer traded off that advantage for another advantage, okay? And the advantage that he has now is this critically weak pawn on e5, you know, which the dark square bishop was lending pretty good support to. And look at this classic Swiss cheese pawn structure that black has on the king side now that this dark square bishop is off the board. So nice positional exchange from Fischer to really try to exploit the dark square weaknesses in black's camp. Unzicker exchanges, so now Fischer has control over the open A file. Now let's pause here, and this is really instructive, okay? I'm going to ask you to try to find Fischer's next move in this position. And I'll give you a hint, okay? This is a quiet position. Fischer does not win material on his next move. He does not launch some brilliant sacrificial attack. No. This is a quiet position. And very often, these are the kinds of positions that chess players struggle with most. My students included. So, pause your video and give yourself a think. What should white play here? A good question to ask yourself in a position like this is, what's my worst placed piece? What are the weaknesses in my opponent's position? Okay. If we take a look at white's pieces, this queen is on a fantastic post. It's nice and active on the king side, eyeing up a lot of key squares. This rook is perfectly placed on the open A file. Okay, Fischer did a nice job gaining control over that key strategic asset in the position. The lazy piece in white's position, the one that's not really doing anything, is this bishop on c2. So congratulations if you even noticed that and came up with a bishop move for your next move. That's why Fischer played in this position, bishop d1, and he gave that an exclam. And I agree. This is just a really great move and a really great example of how you can look to play quiet positions like this, where it looks like nothing's going on. What's your worst placed piece? Where are the weaknesses in your opponent's position? Can often lead you to the right move. And here, Fischer identified his worst placed piece and is now going to reroute it to e2 to target this weak pawn on b5. And after knight f6, rook a7, okay, the rook infiltrates, queen d6, putting pressure on the bishop on d1. Fischer just simply brings it to e2, and surprisingly, this pawn is really difficult to defend. Unzicker plays rook e7, trying to alleviate some of this pressure on the 7th rank, okay, which is really exacerbated by the fact that he played the move f6 and no longer has an f-pawn. So his king is really feeling some heat with the rook on a7. So Unzicker understandably looks to trade it off, but this just allows Fischer to win this weak pawn on b5. Okay, so Fischer's up a pawn. And after king g7, bishop e2, Fischer notes in his annotations that he's clearly better, but the win is far from certain. What he needs to do is promote one of his queenside pawns. He has a 2-on-1 queenside pawn majority. So first things first is create a pass pawn on the queen side. But he also needs to be really mindful about his king. Okay, and especially with queens on the board and this open H file and a weak back rank, Fischer's king is a bit susceptible to a perpetual check from his opponent. Okay, especially if Fischer brings the queen and the bishop over to the queen side to try to escort this pawn. The king might lack some defenders and be susceptible to this check. So something Fischer needs to watch out for. Queen c7. Okay, now there's a small threat in the position. This move unpinned the knight, so now black is threatening knight takes e4, but Fischer's got it under control. Queen e3, defending the e4 pawn. Queen a5. Unzicker just looking in this position to bring the queen over to where the action is and to try to blockade this b4 square. Unzicker simply wants to prevent Fischer from obtaining a pass pawn on the queen side, but easier said than done. Fischer plays g3 here, giving his king some left. The king can come up to g2, as it does here, and it's nice and cozy. Now, notice after king g2, this pawn on b3 is on prise. But Fischer doesn't mind that. Okay, let's just say in this position, black captures on b3. Well, now the c5 pawn is undefended. And all that Unzicker managed to do in taking on b3 was just accelerate Fischer's plan. Okay, Fischer didn't need to orchestrate the breakthrough b4. He got his pass pawn basically handed to him on a silver plate. So that's why in this position, after king g2, Unzicker just brought the queen back to a5. All he can really do is wait. He doesn't have an active plan right now. He's just trying to make this breakthrough as hard as possible for his opponent. Queen queen d3, queen b6, queen c4. So really nice creeping maneuvers by Fischer's queen, just worming his way into the position. And now he's got this b4 square under control, which means Fischer can now look to play pawn to b4 and create his passed pawn. Queen c6, okay, not just yet. Black's got some pressure on this pawn on e4. How to defend it? Well, playing f3 is possible, which would definitely give the bishop more freedom to move, but that would really weaken White's king side, especially on the second rank. And then I think the threat of a perpetual would become even more likely. So that's why Fischer just played bishop d3. Let's keep the king side nice and safe. Queen b6, and of course, now that everything's nice and protected, Fischer plays b4. Takes, takes. Okay, so the first phase of the plan is complete. Fischer has got his passed b pawn. Okay, Black is going to look to try to blockade this pawn somehow and combine that with potential threats against the enemy king, which Unzicker starts in earnest with knight g4, threatening an invasion on f2. So Fischer plays queen c5 in this position, offering the exchange of queens. Now, Unzicker ideally would like to avoid the exchange of queens, but it's really difficult to do so in this position, namely because of the weakness of this Eve pawn. Let's say, for example, queen d8. Fischer points out that after bishop e2, just simply removing the defender, which is hanging right now, of the e5 pawn, White will just be crashing through, and this game would be over in short order. So that's why Unzicker reluctantly had to agree to the exchange of queens. So now Fischer has a passed c pawn, and it's one step closer to promotion. King f7. Okay, Unzicker looking to activate his king and to bring it over to the queen side to prevent its promotion. f4. Great job by Fischer here, looking to create a second weakness in his opponent's position. So he's looking to create another passed pawn, this one being on a central file. Okay, so this is a good illustration in the endgame of the principle of two weaknesses. Okay, so very often you're able to create a threat, right? A weakness that your opponent has to defend against. And usually they have enough resources in their position to hold things together. But once you create a second weakness, then their defenses are stretched too thin, and that's when you can have a decisive breakthrough. So that's why Fischer played f4 in this position, is to create a second front, a second weakness. King e7, king f3. Okay, Fischer activates the king with tempo, driving the knight back. And then we have bishop b5. Okay, so nice move from Fischer, really boxing this king and knight out for some key squares over on the queen side. King e6, bishop c4, king e7, and then c6. So nice move restricting this knight. Fischer can also perhaps look, if this knight ever moves, to attack the weak pawns on the king side as well. Knight e8. So Unzicker retreats, bringing his knight into a blockading position. But this allows Fischer to capture on e5. And after h6, king e3. Okay, now Fischer is looking, now that he's created a second weakness, this central pass pawn, he's going to look to invade on the queen side with his king and try to escort this passed c pawn to the promotion square. Okay. But after knight c7 blockading, king d4, h5, I'll turn it over to you again in this position. Okay, Fischer was looking to infiltrate with the king on the queen side, and Black has just played the move pawn to h5. What did Fischer play here? Pause your videos. Try to find the best move. Okay, so Unzicker played pawn to h5, assuming Fischer had abandoned the king side with the king, he's maybe looking on a good day to play b5 and h4 and create his own pass pawn to try to get some counterplay. Congratulations if you found Fischer's move king e3. It's like, I can still go back where I came from. Okay, the queen side looked nice, but now the king side looks really good because this pawn move h5 just gave Fischer's king a highway to hell for his opponent. I mean, once this king invades on the king side, it's going to be game over. Unzicker tries to keep the king out, realizing the weaknesses he just created. But after bishop e2, h4, bishop c4, and king f4, now Fischer has another pawn that he's going to be able to collect. And notice this knight is really, really short on squares. All of black's pieces are tied down to the defense of these passed pawns. King d8, king g4, king c7. Okay, key moment here in the game. Fischer would really love long-term to get this knight off the board. Okay, that's... With the knight on the board, black might have some miracle draw chances, especially since Fischer's passed pawns are isolated and doubled. But after bishop f7, knight g8, notice this knight now. It is completely dominated by the bishop and the king. It has absolutely no available squares. Fischer doesn't need to win the piece. He just needs to get it off the board, and then the win will be elementary. So Fischer grabs here. King takes c6, and after king g5, Unzicker resigned in this position. Okay, understandably, but let's just play through the probable game continuation just to see how we would convert this position. Fischer gives after king d7, king f6, the knight's attacked. Notice black can move it to safety, but all we were looking to do is exchange this piece. Okay, and after king takes, king e6, white has the opposition, and this king and pawn ending is very easy to convert. So, awesome game by Fischer. I thought it was really instructive how Fischer used his kingside initiative to provoke his opponent into playing pawn to f6. Okay, the attack was over, but Fischer traded one advantage for another. You know, when you have the initiative, when you have an attack, it doesn't necessarily have to end in checkmate, okay, to be worthwhile. If you can provoke your opponent into making weaknesses that you can then exploit in the endgame, this can be a really good strategy. Okay, so Fischer gave us a model game in how to do that. Okay, his opponent beat back his initiative on the king side, but had to give up the bishop pair, had to make some weaknesses around his king, and take on some loose pawns. Fischer picked one of them off, traded the bishop pair for the advantage of the bishop pair for another advantage, and effortlessly converted in the endgame. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to subscribe. You're not going to want to miss any of the future installments of the series. I will see you next for game number 11. Take care.